This brings us to our final presentation of this particular session before we take a break, and that is to be delivered by my colleague Jeremy Corley, who lectures in sacred scripture here at St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, and is director of research there. And Jeremy is going to be speaking to us on Exile and Sabbath as scriptural models for a time of pandemic. So Jeremy, you're very, very welcome to speak to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Salvador, and thank you to all the participants for continuing and showing great interest in the presentations. Jesse kindly guided us to look at Psalm 137, the whole question about singing the Lord's song in a strange land. How can we do that? How could the exiles do that? In terms of the relationship with God, and what it means suddenly to be in a strange place. And then Gavin also was reflecting on the relationship with God that held by Abraham and how suffering fitted into that, and from a philosophical viewpoint. I'm going to share a screen now in regards to trying to think about scriptural models for a time of pandemic. And the first one will be the exile. So this will be building on what Jesse's done. And then the second one, if you've got time, to say something about the Sabbath as well. Okay, so and there's a ancient archaeological picture of the exiles going off. We don't know whether it's the Jewish exiles or others, but from that kind of time frame anyway. Okay, so living in exile. So as we know, the COVID pandemic has turned all our lives upside down. And the media's reported, especially on medical details, how many cases, how many deaths, how many people in hospital, also social aspects. And looking at religious implications, we've looked, for example, at the effect of transfers of mass online, postponements of communions, weddings, confirmations, those kind of things have attracted attention. And here, obviously, there are many pictures on the television. Every night we see pictures of hospitals, patients, doctors, carers, nurses, etc. So we can look at various health effects and our own reaction of lament. Now, what I'm going to be speaking of is not the specific suffering of the patients suffering COVID. I'm going to be reflecting on the experience of ourselves as a society where the pandemic is rife and the effects from that. So the first effect, obviously, people dying and bereavements. And we may well know people who've lost people to COVID. We possibly might even have been bereaved ourselves. And as we know, not just people dying, but also many people sick in hospital, and then maybe people coming out from hospital and sometimes suffering trauma afterwards, so-called long COVID or post-COVID. And what's become very apparent recently during the present situation, a fear of catching COVID ourselves. In the summer, things might seem to be a little better, but now, with the new strains and so on, the fear of catching COVID, and not only for ourselves, but also fear for our loved ones and for the vulnerable. Again, another picture from a hospital team, perhaps reflecting on the best course of treatment for a particular patient. So our lament concerns some of the social consequences. As we all know, there have been drastic social consequences. At the moment, we're experiencing your severe lockdown. Here, I can only go 5 kilometers unless I have a special reason to do so. Many, or even possibly we could say most workplaces at the moment are closed. And so in many cases, it's not possible to see family and friends. So for example, at Christmas, normally I would go over to England to see my brother and my sister. This Christmas, I wasn't able to do this. As we know now, church is closed in many places. And hence that means none of the normal sacramental celebrations. Okay, well, funerals can go on under very great restrictions, and also weddings on a very tight restriction, but pretty well everything else is not happening. And in our daily lives, whether we go into shops, any other place, face masks have to be worn, and then we have to keep to social distancing. We can't shake hands or hug our friends, etc. So these are just some of the social consequences that are very obvious. Again, wearing a face mask. But then deeper questions. Where or how can we find God in this pandemic? So this is some of the reflection that we've been looking at today. And is God somehow speaking to us through this crisis? Can we somehow detect or try to discern what might be the call of God to us? And then as people of faith who read the scriptures, is there any help that we can find in the scriptures? And I'm going to suggest that there are a couple of motifs in the scriptures, the exile and the Sabbath, that might possibly be of some help. And you also may have other scriptures that could be helpful. Many people, for example, find the simple psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd," Psalm 23, very helpful, and which of course it is. But anyway, so Jesse already reflected a little bit on this scriptural model of the Jewish experience of the Babylonian exile, which of course ended when the Jews were eventually allowed to return to the Holy Land. So we'll look at that. And then the other scriptural model, which I'd like to look at if time permits, is the Jewish practice of the Sabbath, resting on the seventh day. And on the basis of the fact that in previous times, sometimes our society has been 24/7, no time to rest. And of course, now we have this enforced Sabbath, this enforced time of rest, when perhaps we can take stock of our lives. So we'll look at these two elements, exile and Sabbath, if time permits. So here we have an artist's impression of the exiles by the rivers of Babylon, lamenting, mourning, remembering Zion. And this is precisely what Jessie was talking about when she reflected on Psalm 137. So during this time of exile, we can turn to the scriptures, hopefully to find help in making sense of what's happened to us. And the scriptural authors came to understand their experience of being deported into exile in the strange land of Babylon. And we can reflect on that. And as Jessie said, we can share their feelings of being alienated from all that was familiar, the normal life that we used to have, and being forced to adapt reluctantly to new circumstances. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, there we wept when we remembered Zion. So thinking back to how things were in the past, and now reflecting on the changed circumstances of today. Again, another artist's impression on the lament of the exiles, hanging up their harps and thinking back to how it was when they were in Jerusalem. But the lament of the Jewish exiles could cover many different aspects. The bereavements from war, when the Babylonian army came and captured Jerusalem, there would have been people killed, so families would have been bereaved. Many homes would have been destroyed and burnt. And then the people would have been deported to a strange land. How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? People would easily have been separated from family and friends. For example, it looks as though the very poorest of the people were left in the Holy Land, but many of the wealthier people and more skilled people were taken into exile in Babylon. So families would easily have been separated. Very significantly, the Jerusalem temple was destroyed, and that meant that there was nowhere suitable for communal prayer, nowhere time-honored as the temple was. So again, an artist's impression of the destruction of the temple, the burning of the temple with fire that was done by the troops of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon at that time. And thankfully, we haven't seen that, but we've certainly seen churches closed. So I'd like to reflect a little bit on a short book of the Bible, only 5 chapters, the book of Lamentations. Now, we don't often read it. The tradition was that it was often read during Holy Week, the lament for the sufferings of Christ. But we don't often read this short book. But the author of the book of Lamentations, traditionally identified with the prophet Jeremiah, lived through the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. So these 5 short chapters have poetic laments expressing the grief and the anguish of the Jewish people faced with war and killings, foreign oppression and disasters. And obviously, our circumstances in 2021 are different. Thank goodness, we're not facing an invasion by enemy troops, but it is another kind of invasion, an invasion by an invisible enemy, namely the virus. And we may feel some of the same emotions and feelings about the severe disruption to our lives. So let's look at chapter 3 for a moment. This is just the lamenter voicing the experience of suffering and pain. I am one who's seen affliction under the rod of God's wrath. So already the person praying is saying, that God is behind this, that God is somehow expressing his displeasure, anger, or maybe God's trying to teach us something. Anyway, we can reflect on whether we want to use this approach to the COVID pandemic today, but that's what Lamentation says. I'm one who's seen affliction under the rod of God's wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Against me alone he turns his hand again and again all day long. So again, the sense of darkness, the sense of going on and on and on. God has made my flesh and my skin waste away and broken my bones. He has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. Then it goes on, God has made me sit in darkness like the dead of long ago. It seems like a kind of living death. God has walled me about so that I cannot escape. He's put heavy chains upon me. We can't just go around anywhere that we want. I can't just jump on a plane and fly to England. Though I call and cry for help, God seems to shut out my prayer. He's blocked my ways with hewn stones, and he's made my paths crooked. I can't move forward as I used to do. And again, an artist's impression of Jeremiah weeping over Jerusalem. And then a little later in chapter 3, God has made my teeth grind on gravel and made me cower in ashes. My soul is bereft of peace. I've forgotten what happiness is. And so I say, gone is my glory and all that I'd hoped for from the Lord. So the glory, the happiness, the peace, the well-being that we had in the past suddenly seems to have disappeared. All that I hoped for from the Lord is no longer happening. And of course, here in Maynooth, I'm thinking of what we have here, apart from the seminarians being here, but we have an empty campus, and all the students that were looking forward to studying, and also school students looking forward to going to school, not able to do that. All that they'd hoped for and expected, not happening. The thought of my affliction, and indeed my homelessness, being exiled to Babylon, is wormwood and gall. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me. So again, we can feel the emotion, the grief, the sorrow here in these lament. But then there's a kind of a stage forward that the author goes through, as somehow being lifted up by hope. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. His mercies are new every morning, because great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. We don't know exactly what's provoked this change. Is this something going on inside, some movement of the soul, if you like to say, or has something happened that's renewed the hope of the author? Again, there's, I think that's from the Sistine Chapel, I think, again, Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. Okay, so that's the just the consideration of the idea of the exile and the destruction of Jerusalem. But I'd like to then link that with a second consideration. That's the consideration of the Sabbath. And these two are linked in an interesting passage at the end of the book of 2 Chronicles. So in hindsight, one scriptural interpretation of the exile taught the Israelites that it was the land that needed to make up its Sabbaths. The land needed to rest and be quiet. And the Sabbaths had been missed during all those previous years. So after Jerusalem had fallen to the enemy, the book of Chronicles offers this interpretation of the deportation and exile to Babylon. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword. In other words, the Judeans, the people of Jerusalem. And how long is he going to keep them in Babylon? Until the land had made up for its Sabbaths. And all the days that it lay desolate, the land kept Sabbath. So think about rest. And in this case, this is an enforced rest. This isn't a rest that they would have done every 7 days as the Torah commands. This is an enforced rest brought about by a foreign invader. So, Sabbath for busy cities. We could say that during the lockdown, during the COVID pandemic, it sometimes felt as though nature has pressed the pause button on our human lives, or perhaps the reset button. So normally busy cities of the world, whether it be Los Angeles, Beijing, Delhi, etc., blue skies have once again been visible without the pall of soot and smog and smoke, and fish were seen again in the canals of Venice. And so on the left, New Delhi in previous time, on the right, the clear skies of recent times during the pandemic. So according to the scriptural author, because of their sinfulness, the people of Israel were taken into exile in Babylon, but that left the Holy Land free to enjoy its Sabbath rest. Now for us today, the shutdown because of the virus has often felt like a home exile. We've been away from our normal places for work or study, and we're sort of exiled, but exiled in our own homes. So it's a little bit different, a little bit strange. But nevertheless, like the Jewish Sabbath, this time may have allowed us the space and the time and the opportunity to reflect on our lives and discover what's truly important for us. Again, another picture of New Delhi before and after. So just as the Babylonian exile and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem meant that the Jewish people were away from their traditional forms of worship, so during the lockdown, the church buildings have often been closed. There've been no public masses apart from very small funerals and perhaps even smaller weddings. And some people have rediscovered personal and family forms of prayer, and many have watched live stream masses available online. We had a little bit of reflection on that in the morning with Anne Cod and with Salvador Ryan. Church will be closed until further notice due to the COVID-19 coronavirus. May God help us all. We're going to notice in front of a church. But nevertheless, there's another side of it, and this is something that would also bear a great deal of reflection in the future, whether it be for clergy, whether it be for parish pastoral councils, whether it be for each one of us, people of faith, masses held online. So a definite sense of loss. So many people have been unable to physically receive the sacrament of Holy Communion. I know they talk about spiritual communion, but it's not quite the same. But there's also been the bigger sense of loss of the sense of belonging. People have been unable to join the faith community physically for worship, Sunday Mass, also funerals as well, and other occasions, First Communions and so on. So watching online is a great blessing, but it's not the same thing as actually being there in person with the community. So again, families or individuals watching Mass online, you know, that's a great blessing and a great opportunity, but it's not quite the same thing as being there physically, face to face and in person. So during the Babylonian exile, the Jewish people were away from their country until the land enjoyed its Sabbaths. These were the Sabbaths that the land hadn't experienced during the previous years. Now for us, in our time, the farmland has continued to be cultivated. So there's no Sabbath for the land. But nevertheless, the towns and the cities have often experienced a kind of Sabbath. We've had restaurants closed, bars closed, hotels closed, streets empty, apart from a few food shops. Many workplaces have been shut down for weeks and indeed sometimes months. That's a picture taken, I think, early during the first lockdown. I think that's Cork, if I'm not mistaken, with the Bangarda looking over the site there, the empty streets. So Sabbath and creation. So the first creation story describes God creating the world in 6 days and then resting on the 7th day. But until recently, our society tended to operate 24/7, day and night, morning, noon, evening, nighttime, without taking time for rest, so it seems sometimes. And perhaps we've overlooked at our peril the wisdom that God has offered us. We should work for 6 days, but rest on the 7th day. So time to reflect. And during the pandemic and the lockdown, people have stayed at home. And so instead of the mad daily rush of work and also leisure, many people have found themselves with more time, perhaps time to think and reflect, time to appreciate nature, time to go for a walk, and hopefully perhaps time for prayer. I've seen around here lots of parents taking a walk with their young children, and the children getting more family time that they might not have had in the normal situation. So the pandemic has been a kind of exile, but Scripture offers us hope. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul that seeks him. And hope, of course, has begun to return now that the vaccination program has been opened up. So I would say that the pandemic has been a kind of Sabbath, but the enforced rest may have given us time to think and reflect, and hopefully time for prayer. So these scriptural models, the exile and the Sabbath, may be some possibility for us to kind of draw some kind of meaning and sense from the suffering that we've been going through. But there may also be other scriptural texts as well that might be of interest and help to people.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was wonderful, and again has provided us much food for thought, not only biblically but also contemporaneously in our current situation. and how we respond to it. So I just see there is already one question has come up on chat. In a world in which we've lost the whole notion of Sabbath, in a world in which being with oneself is uncomfortable for many, how do we encourage and seek out these Sabbath moments in our lives as a positive going forward post-COVID? And that's from Father Tony.
Yes, no, that's a very good question. And really, in a sense, everybody's been faced with that question now, because many workplaces closed, schools closed, universities and colleges closed. And also, even another thing, not being able to travel. I can only go 5 kilometers at the moment. So I can't just, I like to go and have a walk by the sea, for example. I can't even go down to the coast now to have a walk, and so on. So there's an enforced sense of having the Sabbath. The Sabbath's kind of come to us rather than us seeking out the Sabbath. It's come to us. And so, and as you rightly say, Tony, that in many cases, being alone, being with oneself, being reflective, and so on, can for some people be uncomfortable or challenging or difficult, or take some getting used to. And we're so used to having people around us and being gregarious and meeting up with other family members, relatives, friends, going for a meal, going for a drink, etc., etc. Also meeting up with the parish communities as well. That suddenly we're in a situation, an enforced Sabbath, and isolation and fragmentation can be very dangerous and unhelpful, and so on. But on the other hand, the other side of it is the kind of the Sabbath and the space to reflect, and so on. But your question is, how do we encourage these Sabbath moments in our lives, and how do we encourage for ourselves and for others? I suppose for ourselves, I suppose that we're not, in one sense, we're not alone, because God is with us. And somehow this does give us space and time and the opportunity to reconnect more fully and directly with God. In regard to other people, I suppose all we can do is share our own experience, what we found helpful for ourselves. I wouldn't want to kind of be telling other people what to do, but we can at least share, what we found helpful. I don't know whether others would agree.
Jeremy, I really liked how you reflected on how there's a chance for prayer that it can occur through all of this, and I think that resonated with Salvador's paper on the different sort of devotions that we had. Do you think that it's a good idea that we should see this lockdown and our lack of access to the sacraments, particularly the Eucharist, as an opportunity to sort of dispose ourselves once again for the kind of liturgical prayer that can come along whenever we return to Mass? So those sorts of devotions that Salvador was talking about, which sort of form the backbone of a spiritual life, which is then graced through, participation in the sacraments.
Yes, there's obviously our individual prayer life, our prayer to God and so on, and our spiritual life and so on. And then there's also the communal life, and especially the liturgy, the Mass and so on. And at the moment we're deprived of the face-to-face experience of the public liturgy and so on. But that doesn't stop us with our personal prayer, or if we're in a family prayer, or a religious community, a close bubble of a community, that kind of prayer. And certainly, our personal prayer can also help us to, once again, when the chance arises, to enter into the liturgical prayer. But I wouldn't even see it like that. I would say that there are, in different situations, there are different forms of prayer. And at the moment, what's open to us is the personal prayer, whereas at the moment the public liturgical prayer is not open to us. So we pray in the way that we can in our own situation. So hopefully then when everything opens up, we will be able to regather liturgically in a community. But at the moment, what we have is the opportunity for personal prayer.
Just my very quick observation about the Sabbath, which I think certainly the people in the time of Jesus often forgot, is we can use Sabbath. It can become quite self-centered on my being religious, whereas Jesus takes them back to the meaning of Sabbath, which is you were slaves in Egypt, it is in Deuteronomy, and God has set you free, and therefore you may not make anybody else work. So I think it can often become the people who can benefit from COVID. I know I speak for myself in terms of I have a nice house, I have all my family here with me. It's great, I can enjoy the Sabbath, but actually we should be thinking about, are we enabling other people to have a Sabbath?
Maybe a comment. Thanks for your presentation, Jeremy. I liked it very much. I'm aware of a number of WhatsApp groups based on religious, putting in spiritual thoughts, religious thoughts, reflections. Now, it seems to be very uncoordinated, so anything can go as well. But it's as far as I can see, it's a feature that's growing at the moment. And just going back to something that we did, and based on the book that I published last October, we ran a program in our parishes online, and we actually got a response of about up to 80 people who took part in it. So I'm just saying that there is that hunger and that need out there. Just a comment I'm making. Yeah.
No, I would fully agree. And up till now, we haven't, we've relied on face-to-face gatherings, and I think there is a hunger also, and especially now in the present situation, for something to be offered online, and whether it be WhatsApp, Zoom, and all the other different media that we have. So I want to encourage everybody, insofar as it's possible and helpful, that this is a good forum that we have.
So I'd like to take this opportunity to draw this session to a close, and to thank our three speakers, to thank Jesse, Gavin, and Jeremy for a wonderful session.